So the standard Primaris Marine with a bolt gun is now a force to be reckoned with on the tabletop once more. Let's talk about the standard Intercessors, and their newfound ability to just pulverise one wound infantry, spitting out 4 AP1 bolt shots per guy, and more. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd revisit the Intercessor squad, talk about how powerful they are in game, and how their units' role and use might have changed a good amount given that they just got handed massive amounts more damage. Let's talk briefly about their lore and models, go through their datasheet bit by bit, and talk about their buffs and synergy options and how I choose to field them in game. The Intercessors might be some of the most central 40k models out there at the moment. Space Marines have long been Games Workshop's favourite flagship faction. Standard Space Marines with bolt guns have always been their most iconic unit, and these guys were essentially the tactical squad reimagined for the Primaris age. Bigger, badder bolt rifles with extra damage, and generally the models were pretty nicely received, their helms being a throwback to a previous Horus Heresy era armour mark, and their size and stature being a big boost, and maybe delivering on a desire to have true-scale Space Marines, which people had often had in the past. Their lore was tied in with the rollout of the Primaris in general, with Belisarius Corps having hidden a whole bunch, all ready to go for when Guilliman sanctioned them, and the Intercessors in particular are basically the line infantry of the Space Marines, tactically flexible and able to plug the gap and hold the line against enemy infantry formations, and being Space Marines are always very capable of heroics against tougher opponents out there. Currently the kit's £40, €51 or $62 from Games Workshop. As Space Marines go, the 10-man squads aren't the worst deal in the world, 2.6 points per dollar and a bit more plastic than some of the 5 model or 3 model box sets, though in general it can be kind of easy to get your hands on these guys discounted in one way or another. They appear in a couple of Combat Patrol box sets at the moment with the Black Templars and the Dark Angels, and there were quite a lot of them going around in 8th edition in particular, with a bunch of options for easy build ones. I feel like the models themselves are nice enough, they were pretty well received and do a good job as your standard issue Space Marines. The individual bolters have a bit of customization with the Stalker or Auto Bolt Rifle variants, though mercifully they've all got the same rules in game now, which I must admit I thought was quite a good change when they made that. It was a bit fiddly otherwise, nobody really tended to play WYSIWYG, and there always tended to be one or the other profile that was just flat out better. Otherwise in the box they've got a grenade launcher for one of them to be upgraded with, though they are missing some war gear options for the Sergeant. They can take Thunder Hammers and Power Fists, though those options don't appear in the box, they're just options because they appear on certain upgrade sprues. It does mean that if you want an optimal squad loadout, you might need to do a little bit of conversion. In any case, as ever, if you're looking to pick up some Battle Line Space Marines, or other Warhammer 40k kits in general, feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers linked in the video description. Pretty big savings on expensive Warhammer around the world, 10 to 21% depending on where you are. Places like Element Games in the UK for 15 to 20% off, or Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%. None of those cost any extra to use, and they do help to support the channel a bit on any purchases, so a massive thank you for anyone choosing to pick up stuff there when they do. Let's get into the datasheet and rules though, and your standard Intercessor squad is 80 points per 5 of them, going up to 160 points per 10. They're battle line, so it does mean that if they are good and you want to spam them, then you can put absolutely loads of them on the table. In general, it didn't tend to be a super good idea before, though looks a bit more tempting now, and I wouldn't be surprised if at least some people decide to. For their durability, they've got the standard Space Marine stat line, 2 wounds at toughness 4 with a 3+ save. For 16 points, I wouldn't say that's standout durable, but also not standout weak either. They'll be sort of averagely tough against things like anti-tank weapons and small arms, but in general tend to be most weak against things like flat damage 2 weapons with a little bit of AP. Heavy bolters and plasma guns and things can go through them incredibly quickly. Otherwise, as the troops equivalent of the army, they have OC2, so have a lot more weight on objectives than your average unit. They've got the Tacticus keyword for embarking and transport, and they've got the Grenades keyword for a few mortal wounds as and when you need them. Before we get into their improved damage, one of the main draws to taking the unit is their objective secured rule, quite a common and helpful support one throughout Warhammer 40k, basically the sticky objectives rule, which means that if you hold an objective in your command phase, then that objective will basically remain yours until your opponent actually manages to take it, in their case at the start or end of any turn. It can be pretty helpful just for helping out scoring. In practicality, it's got 3 main advantages. If your opponent shoots you down but can't get to the point, then it'll remain yours if you have this one in play, so it means that if they just die on an objective and the opponent's nowhere near them, that'll still be your point with your flag planted in it. It means that you could move them off an objective that they were holding to potentially screen out deep strikers or take the fight to the enemy and deal damage, and if you know that the opponent doesn't have any units that could contest or score that objective, then you can still know that it's absolutely safe. So from time to time, particularly towards the end of the game, you might well be able to decide that you don't need to waste the squad there, and they can push up and add their weight to the midfield objectives to get some last minute points. Otherwise, and maybe a bit more rarely, if the point just winds up being perfectly contested, so your opponent has as much objective control as you do on it after a melee or something, then basically you still get to retain that point, so just a tiny bit of extra pressure and a bit of a tiebreaker there. In general, the rule means that it's often nice to have an Intercessor squad towing on to the home field objective at the start of the game, so they can use that rule turn 1. Just good to have it active on your home point, even if they do go off to do other things after that. And given the changes to things like 3-inch deep strike recently, it might just be a bit more tempting to have that utility versus the 12-inch deep strike denial, given that it's often left to infiltrators to hold down the home field with that rule. Since the nerf to 3-inch deep strikes, it's maybe going to be just a little bit less tempting to have them, even if that's still a very powerful option. Onto their damage dealing though, and we'll start out with the slightly less exciting melee damage, though they can still pack a punch in close combat. Your standard issue Space Marines get close combat weapons, so 3 attacks at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1. 12 attacks plus the sergeant's attacks then, and it still means that they will be able to clear out things like toughness 3 infantry and close combat pretty well. And the sergeant can add a little bit more quality melee, either taking a power fist or a thunder hammer, both of which are at least fairly close in power. The power fist hits on a 3+ at strength 8, AP 2, damage 2. The thunder hammer hits on a 4+, so fewer hits, but it gains devastating wounds. Some people prefer one or the other. I feel like I see more people going for the power fist out of the two of them, though I think they're both fine, and basically are the ones that you want compared with the power sword and the chainsword. He can take those in addition to his bolt rifle as well, which is nice, so you don't have to sacrifice that. And even before the boost to the bolt rifle changes, I still would have taken a bolt rifle on the sergeant rather than plasma pistol or hand flamer, but far more so now given that the bolt rifle's got such a big buff. In any case, for cheap objective grabbers, their melee is not too bad, killing around about 5 horde models like termagants, or around about 2 slain space marines on average, mainly due to that power fist getting to work. Finally though, for their big improvement, their range damage just got massively buffed in the last balance update, going from something that was kind of incidental to genuinely fearsome bolt fire with a massive shooting output for how many points they cost. At base, their bolt rifles are 2 attacks at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1. They get those 2 shots out to 24 inches, and they also have the assault keyword, which means they can advance and shoot, or the heavy keyword where if they choose to remain stationary, they'll be hitting on a 2+ for a small damage boost. That wasn't awful, and it means that you'd basically chip away at lighter infantry squads, but their range damage wasn't really so significant that you'd really fear it. Now though, in the balance update, they got a bonus special rule called Target Elimination, where basically each time this unit is selected to shoot, it can use the ability, and if it does until the end of the phase, you add 2 attacks to the characteristics of bolt rifles equipped by models in the unit, but you must fire all your weapons at one enemy unit, so you can't be splitting them out between multiple enemy squads. I feel like it's really not often the Games Workshop just hands out a damage boost where they just double a unit's shooting pretty much, and don't charge any more points for the privilege, so it's definitely a massive boost to the Intercessor squad, even if as mentioned their range damage wasn't exactly great before. The split fire thing I think usually wasn't going to be relevant for any 5-man squads. It's not like they have the damage output to be destroying multiple enemy units per turn anyway, though I guess it might stop you putting the grenade launcher into a different target if something was more optimal. Though I think as a result of the change it maybe pushes you further to take 5-man squads versus 10-man squads, as it feels like 5-man and 20 shots with bolt rifles is probably going to be enough to ruin lighter infantry units without wasting too much on overkill. Though as we'll see in a second, you can get some fairly good numbers out of 10-man squads with a character attached if you want to now. I do think it's a bit borderline though. Finally, as mentioned on top of that, they get their Astartes grenade launcher. You don't have to give up your bolt rifle for it, so one guy either gets a crack shot with 1 strength 9, AP -2 and damage D3 shot, or can use a frag mode with a blast shot with D3 strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. The crack shot is nice to have something with a bit of multi-damage and AP, even if it is just 1 extra attack. Though bear in mind that it doesn't get the assault keyword, so if you're advancing around the board to get to objectives, then you won't be able to fire with this. Overall, just for a basic 5-man squad, this is the damage output with 5 bolt rifles and the grenade launcher getting to fire. For this one I've assumed that they are on the move, so aren't triggering heavy, but also that their targets don't have cover, even if often they are going to get that in 40k. In any case, for your 80 points you kill around about 8 or 9 termagants, 2 enemy space marines, 1 terminator, or around just 1 or 2 wounds to a toughness 10 3+ save vehicle. Basically it's kind of as you'd expect. With their damage 1 weapons, they absolutely pulverise 1 wound infantry. Certainly not out of the question that they could slay their entire points cost in terms of enemy objective grabbers in 1 turn, and with that massive rate of fire they deal pretty adequate damage to space marines as well. perhaps particularly given that if you could shoot and then charge them, you could kill around about 4 of them, so again pretty much wiping out one of their own equivalent units of another faction. They drop off really quite a lot against toughness 5 or more or higher saves, particularly 2+ saves in cover they're not going to do much against, but with their volume fire they're likely going to get a wound or 2 at least, so still could be good for maybe chipping a wound or 2 off an enemy vehicle that's heavily injured, or at least lending fire towards bigger squads where they will contribute, whereas they would almost do nothing before. For unit support, in general my instinct is to kind of keep it light. They're cheap and effective objective grabbers, and putting too many resources into them probably is going to be a bit counterproductive. At least on paper though, Oath of Moment does seem like it could be pretty nice with them, particularly given it gets the +1 to wound for Codex Chapters now, and particularly as that wouldn't just necessarily affect them, it could also be helping out other units as well. Pretty nice if you're mainly using it on a target that your heavy damage dealers are trying to take out, and then essentially your grunt troops with the intercessors advancing towards an objective can also put out a surprising amount of fire with bolters that still wound on a 5 even against the toughest stuff. Otherwise though, for potential generic stratagems, Armour of Contempt could be okay if it's going to make the difference between them living or dying on an objective to sticky it. It's not quite as good as it was before though, post-update. Grenade could chip in against some tougher targets. Between their shooting, grenade and a charge, they could easily be killing their points equivalent of fairly tough elite infantry units as well, which is pretty nasty for base troops. And Overwatch maybe could be okay in a pinch. I believe they would still be able to trigger their double shoot ability, as it doesn't say it's locked to the shooting phase, just when they're selected to shoot. So I guess on average you'd expect around about 3 bolt rifle hits on the enemy unit, which usually isn't going to be worth it for damage, but maybe could be something worth considering for a big 10-man squad with a lieutenant or something, where those 6s would be lethals. Talking of characters, as mentioned my instincts would be to keep the unit cheap and efficient, though if you did want to try and make a 10-man squad work, I feel like a character's usable enough. The lieutenant does seem like one of the best bets on paper. Getting lethal hits makes those bolt rifles a bit more effective against tough stuff, plus allows them to fall back, shoot and charge, and has a bit of melee himself too, so feels fairly well rounded for them. Captains I think are generally going to be better elsewhere, maybe assault intercessors to double down on their damage with wound rerolls. Librarians could be okay to make the unit a bit tougher with a 4+ invulnerable save and add a bit of damage. They're probably more relevant in the Librarius conclave than anything though. They feel like they could be quite efficient there. Otherwise lots of other things that you could run, but they all feel a fair bit more niche to me. I feel like for the most part named characters tend to have more threatening units that they could lead, but certain ones that focus a bit more on range, or ones that just really want any sort of retinue whatsoever, both could look at intercessors with interest. Chief Librarian Tigurius seems like he could work quite well with them, adding his own fairly solid damage, a -1 to hit for the unit and free overwatch if you want it. Azrael seems like he'd be an okay fit for the Dark Angels. He's often seen running with assault intercessors where he can get the big wound rerolls on midfield objectives, but sticky objectives and a whole bunch of solid bolt fire really doesn't seem too bad. He can also give them sustained hits. Or Uriel Ventress might find them a bit interesting as well. Again, another fairly solid option for skirmishing with a bit more weight towards range than melee. Though for him I do feel like he's got some pretty similarly tempting other options, things like assault intercessors or company heroes. For transports, for the most part I'd be tempted to run them on foot in their squads of 5, but again feels like with their added damage output there's a bit more justification to make them work. They just feel like they maybe just don't really need the speed quite as much as some things out there, being able to advance and shoot anyway. An Impulsor would probably be my go-to choice. 5 models to be able to be delivered to the mid-board objectives turn 1, and then either spit out loads of bolt shots or take up a good position in a ruin, and then hopefully put the sticky objectives rule on the point next turn before getting ready to deal their damage. I feel like it's always a little bit questionable though when you're spending the same amount of points on the unit inside the transport as the transport itself, and they wouldn't be able to make as good use of its firing deck compared with say Hellblasters, as they won't be able to trigger their special rule there. Perhaps a drop pod could be kind of funny for 10 of them. It is quite a high points cost luxury investment though, and I feel like for 10 of them you might be overkilling one screening unit if you're all focusing fire on it. I feel like perhaps a single squad of 5 of them in an Impulsor really isn't the worst idea though, but I don't think I'd spam them that way, and I'd likely just field them on foot myself. Talking of bigger squads, I was interested to see what the damage output of them might be if they were given 10 models and a little bit of support. So for this one we have 10 intercessors with a lieutenant, and they're firing at the Oath of Moment target, which you could also aim other things at. For their average damage output with the lethal hits, the reroll hits, and the +1 to wound, you kill around about 28 termagants, which is likely to be overkill for any 1 wound infantry unit. You go through 7 or 8 enemy space marines, so quite a good chunk of those, around 3 terminators, though bear in mind that drops off quite a bit if you're shooting into cover, or around 10 wounds to a toughness 10 or 12 vehicle with a 3+ save. Overall between oath and lethal hits they do at least pretty well into most things, but still aren't really what I call primary damage dealers, and won't be one-rounding tough enemy units in a single round of shooting, even if they can take a big chunk out of them. In terms of the per point efficiency as well, the Lieutenant doesn't really add much to most of these targets if you've already got Oath, and you could maybe just leave him at home and put his points towards another squad of Intercessors if you wanted the same damage output. Then they'd maybe be able to deal with more individual squads if they wanted, or still all focus fire on one Oath target, plus they get more power fists that way. For the Lieutenant combo, this is just comparing them to 10 Hellblasters, which is around about the same points cost at 230. This one's not buying them a Lieutenant just for comparison purposes for the number of points. They do worse against lighter infantry, only 15 termagants versus the 28 on before, but they're far better against Space Marines, killing around 12 and they can split fire, better against Terminators, more like 4 rather than 3, and they don't really care about the cover, which is a big deal, and around 15 wounds to a toughness 10 to 12 vehicle with a 3+ save. Oath at the moment make them pretty legitimately scary against that as well. It does seem for a primary damage dealer the Hellblasters just do a fair bit better, plus could be made more efficient with a Lieutenant if you wanted. They do seem more efficient if you just want to shoot things dead, though I guess I bear in mind that the other combo does have a bunch of other advantages, better OC, sticky objectives, no hazardous, and much better melee with a couple of power fists. Plus, as mentioned, you could just spam more Intercessors and say compare the Hellblasters to 15 but with no Lieutenant if you wanted to, and the numbers wouldn't be crazily different against tough targets if they did all focus fire on an Oath of Moment thing. Otherwise, for detachments, I feel like the vast majority of them at least add something, given that they're the core Space Marine troops. For Gladius, they like all the doctrines well enough. Perhaps Devastator really isn't quite as meaningful for them, given that they already get Assault, but the Assault doctrine could actually be quite good, given that it could allow them to basically advance, shoot and charge, and otherwise the reactive movement stratagem is quite good for objective skirmishers, and Storm of Fire feels like something that you could actually use on them in a pinch. Getting AP2 and ignore cover on those bolt rifles could absolutely shred some hordes if you wanted to. With that stratagem and Oath of Moment, I feel like even a small 5-man squad is going to take a big chunk out of something if, say, they were the only unit that you had exposed to deal a bit of damage on an early turn. Otherwise, they do feel like one of the most relevant units for Anvil Siege Force. They've got the heavy keyword, so if they're able to sit static, then they can get the +1 to wound even without Oath of Moment. And like the heavy Intercessors, they perhaps actually have the durability to be able to, or at least not quite as fragile per point as, say, Hellblasters are. You could also do the sustained and lethal hit combo if you wanted, where they could be fairly brutal on a 10-man squad. Even with the increase on the damage of the heavy Intercessors, the regular Intercessor squad is going to be pretty close to them in terms of damage output, just due to having flatly double the shots bar heavy bolters. Otherwise, most of the rest could add something. The Firestorm could give you strength 5 bolters up close. Librarius feels like it's got enough interesting synergies to have with Librarians, to the point where I feel like you could be tempted with these guys instead of Sturmguard for some of them. They could get extra AP or reroll ones to hit and wound, which are both fairly good. Otherwise, Ironstorm single rerolls could help out the Grenade Launcher or Power Fist a tiny bit. Vanguard Spearhead gets cover and stealth, which makes them a fair bit tougher to kill at range. The +1 to hit and extra AP stratagem there could also be really quite interesting. Again, in theory, that could be a 10-man squad with 40 shots at strength 4, AP2, damage 1, or hitting on 2s on the move. And otherwise, Stormlance and First Company don't have as much specific for them, but they can make use of the detachment rules. Finally, beyond the core codex, the Divergent Chapters could all make some nice use of them, even if they can't get the boosted +1 to wound from Oath of Moment these days. I feel like Blood Angels are probably still going to want to go for Assault Intercessors more than these guys, but it is kind of interesting now how it feels that regular Intercessors are now probably just flatly better than the Death Company version that they have. And if you're maybe not trying to get a unit that can down the toughest stuff around with a Smash Captain attached, then they could still do pretty well. Pretty fearsome shooting followed up by really quite fearsome melee with a bunch of strength 6 AP0 attacks plus a strength 10 power fist on the charge, even if they don't have so much AP. Otherwise, Black Templars and Space Wolves both could get 6+ Feel No Pains for a little bit more raw might, plus extra AP and melee via stratagems. Maybe Ragnar could lead them for the Space Wolves, though it's probably better with the Assault Intercessors for the rerolls. For the Dark Angels, again I feel like they could be a pretty reasonable bodyguard for Azrael, again weighing up against the Assault Intercessors and reroll all wounds on midfield objectives. And for detachments, you could have Unforgiven Task Force, which has a few interesting shooting things, and could theoretically be given the Deathwing keyword for the Inner Circle Task Force if you wanted to, with Asmodai or someone. I feel like Deathwatch probably more want to focus on their Primaris kill teams, at least for big damage combos, but I do feel like the Intercessors with their high rate of fire are probably just good enough to justify in any one army now, at least for a unit or two of them, just literally for their objective grabbing skills and their anti-horde fire alone. all the crazy amount of options that Space Marines have left aside, overall I do think that regular Intercessors look like they're genuinely pretty strong now for Space Marines. I feel like it's now a really easy decision if you wanted to include a 5-man squad of them at the very least, and could easily go for way more. If you have just one squad, then you can stick to your home objective and then move up to have really quite a scary anti-horde shooting unit that could pretty much kill its points cost in enemy lighter infantry and in the right matchup potentially just in one turn. Otherwise, if going for more, I'd probably be tempted just by more squads of 5 initially, using them as cheap objective trading units that can absolutely ruin enemy equivalents, and then if they can get to the mid-board, they've got high OC to actually take the point, and then sticky the objective if they hold it. If they can get into mid-board ruins, then they could be a fairly nasty countercharge threat, just getting a surprising amount of work done. After they move out of cover, shoot things with 20 bolt shots and a grenade launcher, and then charge in with a bunch more volume attacks and a power fist. I certainly feel like anything Space Marine size or smaller would have to worry about that, and between all that I've got enough volume attacks to even threaten to take down a Terminator or two if they were the last models left. I think at first impressions I'd be tempted to go for the small unit role as opposed to big 10-man units, though if you want to make that work it seems far more justifiable than it did before. You just have to decide whether or not something like Hellblasters with more general purpose damage could be better. If you do go for a few in your army, it does mean that you could pretty heavily focus the rest of your list on things that deal with heaviest infantry and tough tanks. I say if you took 3 units of these guys, you've already got 60 bolt shots and a bunch of grenade launchers to try and cut away through hordes, and that's already going to be enough to handle the outlying units of most armies out there. You would have to weigh up going heavy on them versus all the other many options that Space Marines have though. Infiltrators for their 12-inch denial in the backfield, scouts for getting into the midfield early and being cheap trading units, Intercessors now with better melee and buffing the rest of your firepower, assault intercessors with their volume attacks in close combat plus conferring rerolls to characters, and jump intercessors, reavers and outriders all in their own way for speed or deep strike, maybe for being better against secondaries. Heavy intercessors themselves also look interesting too, still having good OC and now much scarier bolters at strength 5 and damage 2. They kind of feel like counter-medium infantry where they're perfectly placed to take out enemy intercessors, but I'd probably rate the regular intercessors as by far the stronger unit overall personally, just through sheer volume of attacks, being cheaper for a small unit, having the sticky objective rule and a power fist. Overall though, it's really quite nice to see the standard Space Marine battle line actually being kind of scary, even if it is weird that their guns basically shoot twice now. I have a feeling that we're going to be seeing a lot more of them on the tabletop, having really quite a lot of utility between objective things and their sheer firepower. In any case though, let me know what you make of the unit. Will they be finding a spot in your army list going forward or not? How do you think about practical use of them in actual army lists, and what would their role be? In any case, I'll leave this one here for now though. As mentioned, if you're thinking about picking up any Warhammer miniatures in the near future, feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers. Their link's down in the video description. A big thank you to anyone supporting the channel using those when picking up models that you would have done anyway. Otherwise though, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming just about every day. And if you'd like to support the videos more directly, the channel's got a Patreon page linked down in the video description. That's got a few benefits, including seeing certain videos early, names in the credits and access to Discord roles and things, and entry into the regular monthly prize giveaways on the channel. Again, a massive thank you to people supporting there. In any case though, I'll leave that one there for now. A big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.